A young man walks through the dusty streets of Jerusalem, his sandals worn thin from countless journeys between the temple courts and the narrow alleyways where merchants hawk their wares. The morning sun casts long shadows across limestone walls that have witnessed centuries of prayer and prophecy. But today something feels different in the air, heavy, expectant, as if the very stones themselves are holding their breath. His name is Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, born into a priestly family in the small village of Anathoth. Yet he carries himself not with the confidence of religious nobility, but with the uncertain gait of someone who senses destiny approaching like storm clouds on a clear day. His eyes, dark and contemplative, seem to see beyond the immediate bustle of daily life to something deeper, more troubling. The year is approximately 627 BC, and Judah trembles on the edge of catastrophe. King Josiah rules from his palace, attempting reforms that feel like trying to patch a crumbling dam with handfuls of clay. In the distance, beyond the hills of Judah, the Babylonian Empire grows stronger with each passing season. Their armies march like locusts across the ancient world, consuming kingdoms that once seemed eternal. But Jeremiah knows none of this yet. Not really. He feels it in his bones, in the way mothers clutch their children closer when strangers pass, in the hushed conversations that stop abruptly when he approaches. There's a restlessness in the land that goes deeper than politics or economics. It's spiritual. It's the kind of unease that settles over a place when the narrative suggests heaven was preparing to speak. Walking through the marketplace, Jeremiah observes the contradiction that defines his world. Vendors cry out their prices for grain and oil while just steps away, priests burn incense to neighboring deities, as the texts describe, in hidden corners. The scent of baking bread mingles with the smoke of unauthorized altars. Children play in the shadows of temples dedicated to Baal and Asherah, their laughter echoing off walls that the sources say should have been torn down generations ago. This is not the Jerusalem of David's Psalms or Solomon's glory. This is a city caught between memory and reality, between the God of their fathers and the seductive promises of neighboring nations. The people wear their faith like a garment they put on for special occasions, comfortable in their assumption that ritual and tradition will somehow shield them from the consequences of their choices. Jeremiah pauses beside a well where women gather to draw water and exchange news. Their voices carry the weight of everyday concerns. Whose daughter will marry whom? Which fields yielded the best harvest? How much longer the rains might hold off? Normal life continues its rhythm, oblivious to the cosmic drama preparing to unfold, but he feels it. In the silence between heartbeats, in the way the wind seems to whisper warnings that no one else can hear. Something is coming. Something that will shatter the comfortable illusions his people have built around themselves like protective walls. The young priest-to-be makes his way toward the temple complex past merchants selling doves for sacrifice and money changers whose scales tip slightly in their favor. The familiar sounds of worship rise from the courtyards. Psalms sung by voices that know the words by heart but whose hearts have grown distant from their meaning. The smell of burning offerings that should represent devotion but often mask deeper spiritual poverty. As he walks, Jeremiah's mind wrestles with questions that have no easy answers. How did his people, chosen by the Almighty Himself, drift so far from their calling? When did compromise become comfortable? At what point did they begin to believe that they could serve both the God of Abraham and the gods of their neighbors without consequence? These are not the thoughts of a typical young man. While others his age dream of marriage and prosperity, of inheriting their father's trades and raising families in peace, Jeremiah finds himself haunted by a sensitivity he cannot explain. He sees too much, too clearly, the gap between what is and what should be. The afternoon heat grows oppressive as he reaches the outer courts of the temple. Pilgrims from across Judah come seeking blessing and forgiveness, yet many of them carry amulets dedicated to neighboring deities. They mouth prayers to the Lord while their hearts chase after promises of fertility from Canaanite goddesses and protection from Assyrian war gods. The priests go through their motions with practiced efficiency. They know the rituals, they can recite the laws, they understand the procedures for every kind of offering and ceremony. But Jeremiah watches their eyes and sees a troubling emptiness. They are like actors performing roles they no longer believe in, going through motions that have become mere profession rather than passion. Standing in the shadow of Solomon's temple, that magnificent structure that once housed the very presence of God, Jeremiah feels a profound loneliness. Not the simple loneliness of being physically alone, but the deeper isolation of seeing truth that others cannot or will not acknowledge. It's the loneliness of the watchman who spots danger on the horizon while everyone else sleeps peacefully. The sun begins its descent toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seem almost prophetic. As shadows lengthen across the temple courts, Jeremiah finds himself drawn to a quiet corner where he can think and pray without interruption. The noise of the day fades to a distant murmur, replaced by the kind of profound silence that often precedes divine encounters. He kneels on the smooth stone floor, worn smooth by countless generations of worshippers. His prayer begins simply as most prayers do, a yearning for purpose, a young man seeking guidance, a heart crying out for understanding in a world that seems to have lost its way. But even as the words form on his lips, Jeremiah senses that this prayer is different. This moment carries weight that he cannot yet comprehend. The very air around him seems to thicken with possibility and dread. The tradition portrays heaven as listening. Heaven was preparing to respond, as the narrative frames it. And when heaven breaks its silence, nothing will ever be the same. The first stars begin to appear in the darkening sky above Jerusalem, ancient lights bearing witness to a moment that will echo through centuries. A young priest kneels in prayer, unaware that he stands on the threshold of becoming one of history's most profound voices of warning and hope. The secret tears that will define his calling have not yet been shed. The visions that will break his heart and reshape his purpose have not yet been revealed. But they are coming, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, like the first tremors before an earthquake, like the silence before heaven tears open and speaks words that will shake nations and change the course of human history. The morning after his prayer in the temple courts, Jeremiah wakes before dawn with a heaviness in his chest that he cannot name. Sleep had come fitfully, filled with strange dreams that slipped away like water through his fingers the moment consciousness returned. All that remains is an impression of great darkness and a voice calling from somewhere beyond the edge of understanding. He sits on the edge of his simple bed, feet touching the cold stone floor of his family's modest dwelling in Anathoth. Through the small window, the sky shows the faintest hint of gray, that uncertain hour when night reluctantly yields to day. The village sleeps around him, peaceful and unaware, while inside his soul something restless stirs like a caged animal sensing the approach of its keeper. At 20 years old, Jeremiah possesses the kind of sensitivity that makes ordinary life feel like wearing clothing that never quite fits properly. While in the rhythms of agricultural seasons his contemporaries find satisfaction in religious festivals, he experiences each day as if his skin has been stripped away, leaving every nerve exposed to impressions that others never notice. His father, Hilkiah, had hoped that his son would settle into the comfortable patterns of priestly service, learn the sacrificial procedures, memorize the liturgical responses, take his place among the temple servants who maintain the ancient traditions with steady, unquestioning devotion. But even as a child, Jeremiah had asked questions that made the older priests uncomfortable. Why did the people bring offerings while simultaneously consulting fortune tellers? How could they sing songs of devotion while their daily lives showed no evidence of transformation? This morning, those childhood questions feel less like curiosity and more like prophecy, as if his young mind had somehow glimpsed truths that his heart was not yet ready to bear. He rises and moves quietly through the house, careful not to wake his family. His mother sleeps deeply, her breathing steady and peaceful. His younger siblings rest in the innocent slumber of those who trust that tomorrow will be much like today. But Jeremiah feels as though he has been appointed to a kind of spiritual insomnia, doomed to remain awake and alert while others rest in comfortable assumptions. Outside, the village of Anathoth begins its slow awakening. Roosters call across the hillsides. Women emerge from their homes to kindle cooking fires. Men stretch and prepare for another day of tending flocks and working fields that their fathers and grandfathers worked before them. It is a scene of timeless continuity, yet Jeremiah experiences it as if watching from behind glass, present but somehow separated from the natural flow of communal life. He walks the familiar paths of his childhood, past the olive groves where he once played with friends who now seem to speak a language he no longer fully understands. They talk of marriage prospects and inheritance rights, of which fields might yield the best crops and whether the rains will come in season. Practical concerns that once seemed important now feel strangely distant, as if he has been summoned to worry about different kinds of weather entirely. The weight in his chest grows heavier as the day progresses. It is not physical pain, but something deeper and more troubling. Like grief for losses not yet experienced, like fear of responsibilities not yet assigned, like love for people who do not yet know they are in danger. By midday, the sensation becomes almost unbearable. Jeremiah finds himself drawn away from the village, up into the hills where he can be alone with his thoughts, and the growing certainty that his life is about to change in ways he cannot imagine. The landscape spreads below him like a scroll written in a language he is only beginning to learn how to read. To the south, Jerusalem rises from the surrounding valleys like a crown of stone and faith. The temple catches the sunlight and throws it back toward heaven, a daily reminder of the covenant between God and his chosen people. But even at this distance, Jeremiah senses something wrong with the picture. The light seems less brilliant than it should be. The city appears smaller, more vulnerable than its reputation suggests. To the north and east, the horizon holds mysteries that make his heart race with undefined dread. Somewhere beyond those hills lie the great empires that view small kingdoms like Judah as stepping stones to greater conquest. He has heard the stories whispered in marketplaces and temple courts. Armies that move like thunder clouds across the landscape. Kings who collect nations the way children collect stones. But it is not fear of foreign invasion that troubles him most deeply. It is the growing realization that his people have somehow lost their way so completely that they no longer recognize the danger they face. They perform their religious duties while their hearts chase after promises that will never be fulfilled. They speak of being chosen while living as if they have chosen to be forgotten. As afternoon fades toward evening, Jeremiah remains wrestling with questions too large for his young mind to contain. What does it mean to be called by God? How does a person know when heaven is preparing to speak? And why does the thought of divine encounter fill him with equal measures of longing and terror? The sun sets behind him, casting his shadow long across the valley floor. In that shadow he sees something that stops his breath. Not a vision exactly, but an impression so strong it might as well be sight. He sees himself standing not as the comfortable priest his father envisioned, but as something far more dangerous and necessary. A voice crying warnings that no one wants to hear. A heart breaking for truths that will bring more pain than comfort. The realization hits him like a physical blow. This strange sensitivity, this spiritual restlessness, this growing awareness of his people's condition. It is not a burden to be endured, but a preparation for something greater and more terrible than he has dared to imagine. He is being prepared not just to serve God, but to speak for God in times when such speaking will cost everything. As darkness settles over the hills of Judah, a young man kneels in the growing shadows and weeps for the first time for sorrows not yet revealed to him. These are not yet the secret tears that will define his calling, but they are their beginning. The first drops of rain before the storm, the first tremors before the earthquake that will reshape not just his life, but the spiritual landscape of his entire nation. The boy who walked up this hill in the morning will not be the same person who walks down in the darkness. Something has shifted. Something has awakened. And though he does not yet know it, heaven has been watching, waiting for this moment when human readiness meets divine purpose. Tomorrow, everything will change. The days following Jeremiah's solitary vigil on the hillside pass like pages in a book written in a language he is still learning to read. Each sunrise brings with it a subtle but unmistakable shift in the fabric of his reality. The familiar becomes strange. The ordinary reveals hidden depths, and in the spaces between heartbeats he begins to hear whispers that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At first he dismisses these impressions as the product of an overwrought imagination. Young men, after all, are prone to dramatic thoughts and heightened emotions. His father had warned him about the dangers of too much solitude, too much contemplation of weighty matters. Focus on your duties, Hilkiah had counseled. Learn the rituals, master the procedures. Let the elders worry about the deeper mysteries, but the whispers grow stronger with each passing day, like a voice calling from across a great distance that gradually draws nearer. They come not as words exactly, but as impressions that settle into his consciousness with the weight of what he understood as divine truth. Images flash behind his closed eyes during prayer. Sensations of movement and change ripple through his dreams. And always, always there is the growing certainty that he stands at the edge of something vast and transformative. The first concrete sign comes during the morning prayers at the temple. Jeremiah kneels among the other young priests, reciting the familiar words that have been spoken in this place for generations. The Hebrew syllables roll off his tongue with practiced ease, their meanings worn smooth by repetition. But suddenly, mid-sentence, the words seem to catch fire in his mouth. The ancient phrase about God's eyes ranging throughout the earth, seeking those whose hearts are fully devoted to him, strikes him with such force that he nearly gasps aloud. It is as if he has never heard these words before, as if they have been waiting his entire life for this moment to reveal their true significance. His hands tremble as he continues the prayer, but his mind races with implications he cannot yet fully grasp. Around him, the other priests continue their worship without pause, unaware of the seismic shift occurring in the soul of the young man beside them. To them, it is another ordinary morning in the house of God. To Jeremiah, it feels like the first morning of creation, when light separated itself from darkness and everything began. The experience leaves him shaken and exhilarated in equal measure. Throughout the day, he finds himself returning to that moment, trying to recapture the intensity of divine proximity. But like trying to hold sunlight in his hands, the sensation slips away, even as he grasps for it, leaving only the memory of its warmth and the certainty that it was real. That evening, as he walks the familiar path from Jerusalem back to Anathoth, the landscape itself seems to participate in his transformation. The olive trees that line the road appear more vivid than before, their silver-green leaves catching the last light of day with an almost supernatural luminescence. The stones beneath his feet seem to hum with hidden energy. Even the dust raised by his passage swirls in patterns that suggest meaning just beyond the edge of understanding. He pauses beside an ancient well where travelers have drawn water for centuries. The circular stone rim, worn smooth by countless ropes and buckets, gleams like polished bronze in the fading light. As he leans over the edge to peer into the dark depths below, his own reflection stares back at him from the still surface of the water far beneath. But it is not quite his reflection. The face looking up at him bears his features, but there is something different in the eyes. A depth that was not there before. A weight of knowledge that makes him appear older than his 20 years. And in that moment of recognition, he understands that he is looking not at who he is, but at who he is becoming. The realization both thrills and terrifies him. To see oneself changing is to confront the reality that the comfortable certainties of youth are dissolving like salt in water. The boy who had played in these fields and dreamed ordinary dreams is being replaced by someone he does not yet fully recognize. Someone with a destiny that feels too large for his young shoulders to bear. As he continues his journey home, the whispers that have haunted his recent days begin to coalesce into something more substantial. Not yet voices, but impressions of voices. Not yet words, but the shadows that words cast before they take concrete form. He finds himself slowing his pace, straining to catch meanings that hover just beyond the reach of his conscious mind. The evening air carries scents that trigger memories he does not remember creating. Smoke from cooking fires blends with the fragrance of wildflowers to create an atmosphere of profound nostalgia for moments that have not yet occurred. Time itself seems to bend around him, past and future colliding in a present moment stretched thin by the weight of impending revelation. By the time he reaches his family's dwelling, Jeremiah knows with absolute certainty that his period of preparation is drawing to a close. The whispers that have teased the edges of his consciousness are gathering strength and substance. Soon they will speak clearly enough to be understood. Soon the gentle impressions will become unmistakable commands. Soon the comfortable ambiguity of his calling will give way to the terrible clarity of divine purpose. His mother greets him at the door with the same loving smile she has offered every evening of his life. His father looks up from his scrolls with the familiar expression of mild concern mixed with paternal pride. His siblings chatter about their day's adventures with the innocent enthusiasm of those who believe tomorrow will be much like today. But Jeremiah sees them all as if from across a great distance, already partially separated from the ordinary rhythms of family life by the extraordinary nature of what is approaching. That night sleep comes slowly and fitfully. His dreams are populated by images that make no logical sense but carry emotional weight that leaves him breathless upon waking. He sees cities he has never visited crumbling into dust. He watches faces he does not recognize weeping tears that somehow belong to him. He hears voices speaking in languages he does not understand. Yet their meanings penetrate directly to his heart. But it is not the dramatic visions that disturb him most deeply. It is the quiet moments between the chaos when a presence he cannot name but somehow recognizes draws near with the patience of eternity itself. These encounters leave him with the overwhelming sense that he is being evaluated, prepared, slowly shaped for a purpose that will demand everything he has, and more than he knows he possesses. Dawn arrives with unusual clarity, as if the night has washed the world clean of all unnecessary detail. The morning light seems sharper, more purposeful than before. Even the familiar sounds of his village awakening carry new significance. Like the opening notes of a symphony he has never heard but somehow knows by heart. Jeremiah rises with the certainty that this day will be different from all the days that have come before it. The whispers that have haunted his recent weeks are no longer whispers. They have become a voice clear and unmistakable, calling his name with the authority of heaven itself. The time of preparation is over. The moment of encounter has arrived. He dresses slowly, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he senses approaching. Each garment feels like armor being donned before battle, each sandal strap like the binding of a covenant he does not yet fully understand but has already agreed to honor. When he looks in the polished bronze mirror that hangs beside his bed, the face that stares back at him is his own, yet transformed by the knowledge that nothing will ever be the same. The door to his room opens onto a world that appears unchanged, but has been fundamentally altered by the simple fact that God has chosen this day to speak. The whispers of the unknown are about to become the unmistakable voice of divine calling, and a young priest from Anathoth is about to discover that his life belongs not to himself, but to purposes greater and more terrible than any human heart can fully comprehend. The moment arrives not with thunder or earthquake, but in the profound stillness that sometimes precedes the most significant events in human history. Jeremiah stands alone in a grove of almond trees outside Anathoth, their bare branches reaching toward a sky that seems to hold its breath in anticipation. The winter morning is crisp and clear, the kind of day when sound travels farther than usual and shadows fall with unusual sharpness. He has come here without conscious decision, drawn by an impulse that felt less like choice and more like inevitability. His feet had simply carried him away from the familiar paths and into this secluded place where generations of his ancestors had perhaps stood at similar crossroads between the ordinary and the eternal. The ground beneath him feels sacred not because it has been consecrated by ritual, but because it has been chosen by purpose. The silence deepens around him until it becomes almost tangible, a presence in its own right. Even the wind seems to pause, leaving the almond branches motionless against the pale blue sky. In this suspended moment, Jeremiah becomes aware that he is no longer alone. Something vast and gentle and utterly beyond human comprehension draws near with the quiet inevitability of sunrise. The first touch of the divine comes not as sight or sound, but as recognition, like a child suddenly aware of a parent's presence in the room. Jeremiah knows without needing to look that he stands before the source of all existence. The whispers that have haunted his recent days converge into a voice that speaks not to his ears but directly to his soul, bypassing all the usual channels of human communication to address the deepest part of his being. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. The words arrive with the weight of what he understood as divine truth, settling into his consciousness like stones dropped into still water. They do not explain themselves or offer context. They simply exist, complete and perfect, carrying within them implications that his mind will spend a lifetime learning to unpack. The voice that speaks them is both infinitely gentle and unutterably powerful, like the sound of deep waters or the whisper of wind through grain. Jeremiah's knees weaken not from fear but from the overwhelming realization that he stands in the presence of the one who spoke the stars into existence, and knows the number of hairs on every human head. The comfortable boundaries between human and divine, between creature and creator, dissolve like mist before the morning sun. He is simultaneously reduced to nothing and elevated beyond anything he had previously imagined possible. Before you were born, I set you apart. Each syllable carries the authority of divine decree, yet also the tenderness of perfect love. This is not the voice of a distant deity issuing commands from an unreachable throne, but the intimate communication of one who has watched every moment of his life unfold. and found in it a purpose that transcends his wildest dreams. The words rewrite his understanding of his own existence, revealing that what he had experienced as random events and personal choices were actually part of a design more intricate and beautiful than any human mind could conceive. The young priest tries to speak, to protest his unworthiness, to explain all the reasons why this calling should fall to someone else. But the words stick in his throat like honey, sweetened and made heavy by the presence that surrounds him. He understands without being told that this is not a conversation in the ordinary sense, but a revelation that must be received rather than debated. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. The final phrase in the divine declaration hits him with the force of a physical blow. Prophet. The word carries weight that makes his soul stagger. He has known prophets, seen their haunted eyes and weathered faces, heard the edge of pain in their voices when they speak of what they have seen. To be called prophet is to be marked for a life of beautiful, terrible isolation, to become a bridge between heaven and earth that must bear the weight of divine truth while remaining rooted in human flesh. And not just prophet, but prophet to the nations. His mind reels at the scope of this calling. He had imagined in his most ambitious moments that he might serve faithfully in the temple, perhaps earning recognition among the priests of Jerusalem. But this commission stretches far beyond the borders of Judah, encompassing peoples and kingdoms he has never seen and whose names he barely knows. The grove around him seems to shimmer with divine presence. The ordinary almond trees transformed into witnesses to this cosmic moment. Light that has no visible source illuminates everything with perfect clarity, yet casts no shadows. Time itself seems suspended, as if this encounter exists outside the normal flow of moments that govern human experience. In this space beyond ordinary reality, Jeremiah sees himself as God sees him, not the uncertain young man struggling with doubts and fears, but the instrument carefully crafted for a specific purpose. Every experience of his life, every moment of sensitivity and questioning, every night of restless seeking has been preparation for this calling. His perceived weaknesses are revealed as carefully designed strengths. His isolation becomes the foundation for the kind of spiritual authority that can only be earned through intimate communion with divine truth. The vision extends beyond his personal calling to encompass the larger drama in which he will play his part. He sees nations rising and falling like waves against the shore. He glimpses the great movements of history that will reshape the ancient world. The rise and fall of empires that seem permanent but are actually as temporary as morning mist. And threading through all of this upheaval, he sees the scarlet thread of divine purpose, weaving even destruction and exile into a pattern of ultimate redemption. But with the revelation comes the cost. He understands without being told that to accept this calling is to surrender any claim to an ordinary life. There will be no comfortable marriage, no children playing at his feet, no peaceful old age surrounded by grandchildren. Instead, there will be isolation and misunderstanding, persecution from those he seeks to serve, and the constant weight of carrying messages that no one wants to hear. The divine presence begins to withdraw, not departing but drawing back to allow him space for response. The choice remains his, as all such choices must. Divine calling never overrides human will, but rather invites it into partnership with purposes larger than any individual life. He can return to Anathoth, resume his quiet existence as a village priest, and live out his days in relative peace and obscurity. Or he can step forward into a destiny that will demand everything he has and more than he knows he possesses. Standing alone in the grove as normal time slowly reasserts itself, Jeremiah feels the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a mantle. The almond trees resume their gentle swaying in the morning breeze. Birds begin to sing again in the branches overhead. The ordinary world creeps back around the edges of the extraordinary moment he has just experienced. But he is no longer the same person who entered this grove. The encounter has marked him in ways that go deeper than flesh, deeper than thought, all the way down to the core of his being where identity itself is forged. Whether he accepts the calling or not, he will never again be able to pretend that the divine is distant or that his life belongs entirely to himself. The tears that come now are neither of joy nor sorrow, but of recognition. He weeps for the boy he has been and for the man he is about to become. He weeps for the comfortable certainties he must leave behind and for the terrible, beautiful truth he has been chosen to carry. And in those tears, the first of many that will earn him the title of the weeping prophet, he finds his answer. In the days that follow his encounter in the almond grove, Jeremiah carries within himself a secret that feels heavier than any physical burden he has ever borne. The divine words echo in the chambers of his heart like thunder reverberating through mountain valleys, impossible to silence, impossible to ignore. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Each repetition of the phrase brings with it fresh waves of awe and terror that leave him breathless and trembling. He attempts to return to the rhythms of ordinary life, but everything has been transformed by the weight of his calling. The morning prayers that once brought comfort now feel like preparation for battle. The familiar faces of his family and friends seem to belong to a world he is already beginning to leave behind. Even the simple act of breaking bread carries new significance, as if every mundane gesture has been infused with prophetic meaning. The scope of his mission reveals itself gradually, like dawn breaking over a landscape too vast to comprehend all at once. He is not called merely to serve his own people, though that would be overwhelming enough. He is summoned to speak to nations whose languages he does not know, whose customs are foreign to him, whose very existence feels as distant as the stars. The boy from Anathoth who once worried about memorizing temple procedures now finds himself appointed as heaven's messenger to the great powers of the earth. In quiet moments, when the full weight of this calling settles upon him, Jeremiah finds himself struggling to breathe. How does one speak to kings who consider themselves gods? How does a young priest address empires that view small kingdoms like Judah as mere stepping stones to greater conquest? The practical impossibilities of his mission stretch out before him like an unconquerable mountain range, each peak higher and more treacherous than the last. Yet beneath the terror lies something else, something that grows stronger with each passing day. It is not confidence in his own abilities, for he possesses none that seem adequate to the task. Rather, it is a deepening awareness of the presence that called him, the voice that spoke his name with such intimate authority that his very soul recognized its creator. The same power that formed him in the womb and set him apart before birth will surely equip him for the work to which he has been appointed. The internal transformation begins almost immediately. Dreams that once brought rest now deliver visions that leave him exhausted upon waking. Images flash through his sleeping mind with such vivid intensity that he often finds himself unsure whether he has been dreaming or receiving divine revelation. He sees cities he has never visited, faces of people not yet born, events that feel both distant and immediate in their significance. One particular vision returns night after night with increasing clarity and urgency. He stands on a high place overlooking a vast plain where armies move like dark clouds across the landscape. The sound of their approach is like thunder that never ceases, growing louder and more menacing with each passing moment. But it is not the armies themselves that fill him with dread. It is the knowledge that somehow, impossibly, he has been chosen to announce their coming. The practical challenges of his calling manifest themselves in unexpected ways. His tongue, once comfortable with the familiar rhythms of Hebrew prayer and conversation, begins to feel clumsy and inadequate. How can words crafted for everyday communication possibly contain the weight of divine revelation? How can human language designed for buying grain and discussing the weather suddenly expand to encompass messages from the throne of heaven? He spends hours alone in the hills around Anathoth, practicing speaking to audiences that exist only in his imagination. His voice echoes off the limestone cliffs as he attempts to find ways to communicate truths that feel too large for any vessel of human speech. The words that emerge often surprise him with their power and poetry, as if some deeper part of himself has been awakened by his calling and now speaks with authority he does not fully understand. But it is not only the practical aspects of prophecy that challenge him. The emotional cost begins to reveal itself with devastating clarity. To be chosen as heaven's messenger is to be set apart in ways that go far beyond the ceremonial separation of priests from ordinary life. It is to become a living bridge between two realms that operate according to entirely different principles, to exist in a space between the divine and human that few can understand and none can truly share. The loneliness that accompanies this realization is unlike anything he has ever experienced. It is not the simple loneliness of being physically alone, but the profound isolation of carrying knowledge that cannot be fully communicated to those who have not received it directly. How can he explain to his family what it means to hear the voice of the Almighty speaking words of judgment and redemption? How can he describe to his friends the weight of being entrusted with messages that will reshape the destiny of nations? His relationship with his father, Hilkiah, becomes particularly strained as the implications of his calling become clear. The older priest had envisioned a different future for his son, one that involved steady service in familiar surroundings, respect from the community, and the quiet satisfaction of maintaining ancient traditions. The prospect of Jeremiah leaving behind the security of established religious life to venture into the dangerous realm of prophecy fills Hilkiah with a mixture of pride and terror that he struggles to express. Their conversations become exercises in mutual incomprehension. When Jeremiah attempts to describe the encounter in the almond grove, his father listens with the careful attention of someone trying to determine whether his son has been touched by divine inspiration or driven mad by religious enthusiasm. The careful questions that follow reveal a heart torn between faith in God's ability to call whomever he chooses and fear for a beloved child who seems determined to walk a path that leads inevitably towards suffering. The young prophet finds himself caught between the absolute certainty of his divine calling and the equally absolute uncertainty of what that calling will require from him. Each day brings new insights into the magnitude of his mission, revelations that both clarify his purpose and deepen his awareness of the cost involved. He understands now that to accept this appointment is to surrender any claim to a life of his own choosing. The personal sacrifices become clear with painful precision. Marriage, which once seemed as natural and inevitable as the changing seasons, now appears impossible. How can he ask another person to share a life that belongs not to him but to purposes he cannot fully explain? Children, those precious links to the future that every young man dreams of, become unthinkable luxuries. How can he bring new life into a world when his calling requires him to announce its coming judgment? Even friendship, that basic human need for companionship and understanding, begins to feel like a luxury he can no longer afford. The gap between his emerging prophetic consciousness and the ordinary concerns of his peers widens with each passing day. Their conversations about crops and commerce, marriages and festivals feel increasingly foreign to someone whose mind has been expanded to encompass the rise and fall of empires. Yet in the midst of these mounting challenges, Jeremiah discovers resources within himself that he had never suspected. The sensitivity that once made ordinary life feel overwhelming now becomes a finely tuned instrument for receiving divine communication. The questions that had troubled him since childhood about the gap between religious profession and spiritual reality now reveal themselves as preparation for a calling that would require him to address precisely those inconsistencies. Most remarkably, he begins to understand that his youth, which he had assumed would disqualify him from serious prophetic ministry, is actually part of the divine design. Older men, comfortable in their established positions and relationships, might lack the flexibility to embrace such a radical calling. But a young heart, still malleable and unencumbered by too many earthly attachments, can be shaped into an instrument capable of carrying messages that would shatter more settled souls. The transformation is not without its moments of rebellion and doubt. There are days when the weight of his calling feels unbearable, when the prospect of a lifetime spent delivering unwelcome messages to unresponsive audiences drives him to his knees in desperate prayer for release. The comfortable anonymity of ordinary life beckons with seductive appeal, promising peace and security in exchange for abandoning this impossible mission. But each time he approaches the edge of surrender, the memory of that voice in the almond grove returns with renewed power. The words that transformed his existence continue to resonate with undiminished authority, reminding him that his life has been claimed by purposes larger than his personal comfort or safety. He belongs now not to himself or even to his family, but to the one who formed him before birth and appointed him to speak messages that will echo through generations yet unborn. As winter gives way to spring in the hills around Anathoth, Jeremiah feels the final vestiges of his former life falling away like leaves in autumn. The boy who once worried about fitting into the established patterns of priestly service has been replaced by a young man who understands that his destiny lies not in maintaining tradition but in challenging it, not in offering comfort but in demanding transformation, not in speaking words that people want to hear but in delivering what the prophetic tradition claims must be delivered. The impossible has become inevitable. The calling that once seemed too large for any human vessel has revealed itself as perfectly matched to the specific vessel that heaven had been preparing for this exact purpose. And though the path ahead remains shrouded in mystery and fraught with dangers he cannot yet imagine, Jeremiah takes his first steps toward a destiny that will make his name synonymous with courage, faithfulness, and the terrible, beautiful burden of speaking for God in times when such speaking seems impossible. The first public words of prophecy emerge from Jeremiah's lips like fire from flint, sparked by the collision of divine command and human courage. Standing in the shadow of Jerusalem's ancient walls, where merchants hawk their wares and pilgrims seek blessing, the young prophet opens his mouth and finds that heaven has filled it with words that cut through the comfortable assumptions of his people like a blade through silk. "The word of the Lord came to me," he begins, his voice steady despite the trembling in his chest. "What do you see, Jeremiah?" The crowd that had been moving past with casual indifference slows, drawn by something in his tone that speaks of authority beyond his years. "I see the branch of an almond tree," he continues, his words carrying the weight of vision received rather than wisdom learned. "You have seen correctly, for I am watching to see that my word is fulfilled." The reaction is immediate and revealing. Some listeners nod with the polite attention reserved for religious discourse, assuming they are hearing another interpretation of familiar texts. Others exchange glances that speak of skepticism and concern, recognizing in this young man's words something more dangerous than conventional temple teaching. But it is the response of the religious establishment that proves most telling. For they hear in Jeremiah's proclamation not just another voice, but a challenge to the very foundations of their carefully constructed spiritual authority. Within days, the whispers begin circulating through the narrow streets of Jerusalem like water finding its way through cracks in stone. Who is this son of Hilkiah who speaks as if he has received direct revelation? By what authority does a young priest from an obscure village presume to address matters of national significance? The questions carry an edge of irritation that will soon sharpen into outright hostility as the implications of his message become clear. The initial resistance manifests itself in subtle forms that would be almost comical if they were not so revealing of human nature's capacity for self-deception. Temple officials who had known Jeremiah since his youth suddenly find reasons to question his qualifications and training. Colleagues who had once welcomed his insights now discover flaws in his theological understanding that had previously escaped their notice. The comfortable fraternity of religious professionals closes ranks against one whose words threaten to expose the comfortable compromises they have made with the culture around them. But it is not merely institutional opposition that Jeremiah faces. The message itself proves to be a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of disruption through every level of society. His words about coming judgment challenge the prevailing assumption that Judah's status as God's chosen people provides automatic protection from the consequences of their actions. His calls for repentance imply that their current spiritual condition is inadequate, a suggestion that strikes at the heart of religious complacency that has settled over the nation like morning mist. The psychological resistance proves even more formidable than the institutional opposition. Human beings possess a remarkable capacity for filtering out information that threatens their sense of security and self-worth. Jeremiah's warnings about impending disaster run counter to the deep human need to believe that tomorrow will be much like today, that the familiar patterns of life will continue indefinitely, that the gods or God will surely intervene to prevent any serious disruption of the established order. His audiences respond with the full repertoire of defense mechanisms that people employ when confronted with unwelcome truths. Some dismiss his words as the ravings of a disturbed mind, finding in his youth and intensity evidence of instability rather than inspiration. Others acknowledge the power of his message while questioning its timing, suggesting that perhaps he has misunderstood when these prophetic warnings should be delivered. Still others accept the theoretical possibility of what the texts frame as divine judgment, while remaining confident that it will surely fall on other nations rather than their own. The personal cost of this resistance begins to accumulate like drops of water that eventually carve channels through solid rock. Each dismissive glance, each mocking comment, each deliberate turning away when he approaches adds to the weight of isolation that settles around him like a heavy cloak. The loneliness of his calling, which had been theoretical during his initial period of preparation, now becomes a daily reality as he discovers that speaking truth to people who prefer comfortable illusions is perhaps the most isolating occupation in human experience. His family relationships bear particular strain under the pressure of his prophetic ministry. His father, Hilkiah, finds himself caught between pride in his son's evident spiritual gifts and concern for the practical consequences of such public prominence. The older priest had hoped that any prophetic calling would manifest itself in ways that enhanced rather than threatened Jeremiah's position within the established religious hierarchy. Instead, he watches with growing alarm as his son's words alienate the very authorities whose approval would ensure his future security. The conversations between father and son become exercises in mutual frustration. Hilkiah counsels moderation, suggesting that divine messages might be delivered in ways that do not provoke unnecessary opposition. Surely the same truths could be communicated with more diplomatic language, more careful attention to the sensibilities of those in positions of power. But Jeremiah finds himself unable to soften words that come to him with the hard edges of divine authority intact. To modify heaven's message for the sake of human comfort feels like a betrayal of the very calling that has transformed his existence. His relationships with peers prove equally challenging as the gap between his emerging prophetic consciousness and their conventional religious concerns widens into an unbridgeable chasm. Friends who once shared his interests in temple procedures and theological discussions now find his preoccupation with visions and divine warnings both incomprehensible and disturbing. Their attempts to restore the easy camaraderie of earlier days only serve to highlight how far he has traveled from the person they remember. The social isolation extends beyond religious circles to encompass the broader community of his birth. In Anathoth, where everyone has known him since childhood, his transformation from promising young priest to controversial prophet generates a mixture of bewilderment and resentment that poisons the atmosphere of his homecoming visits. Neighbors who once watched his growth with benevolent interest now regard him with suspicion, as if his calling somehow reflects poorly on their own spiritual condition. The marketplace becomes a theater of subtle rejection, where merchants who had once greeted him warmly now conduct business with cool efficiency. Children who had run to hear his stories now scatter when he approaches, warned by parents who fear that association with such a controversial figure might somehow contaminate their families. Even the elderly women who had known his mother from childhood begin to cross the street rather than engage in conversation that might force them to confront the implications of his message. The emotional toll of this comprehensive rejection tests the limits of his young faith in ways that his initial calling had not prepared him to expect. The voice that spoke with such clear authority in the almond grove now seems to whisper rather than proclaim, leaving him to wonder in his darkest moments whether he has somehow misunderstood the nature or timing of his mission. The certainty that had carried him through his early encounters with divine revelation begins to waver under the relentless pressure of human opposition and indifference. Yet it is precisely in these moments of doubt and discouragement that Jeremiah begins to discover the deeper dimensions of prophetic calling. The resistance he encounters is not an unfortunate side effect of his ministry, but an integral part of it, a necessary element in the divine process of revealing both the message and the messenger's character. The very opposition that threatens to crush his spirit also serves to refine his understanding of what it means to speak for heaven in an earthly realm that prefers its own counsel. The nights become his seminary, those dark hours when sleep eludes him and he wrestles with questions that have no easy answers. How long must he continue proclaiming messages that fall on deaf ears? What is the purpose of prophecy if it fails to produce repentance? Why has heaven chosen to work through such an apparently ineffective instrument as human speech when divine power could surely compel attention and obedience through more dramatic means? The answers, when they come, arrive not as explanations but as deeper encounters with the presence that first called his name in the grove of almond trees. In the silence of these midnight vigils, Jeremiah begins to understand that his calling is not ultimately about the response of his audiences, but about his own faithfulness to the voice that speaks through him. His success is not measured by the number of converts he makes, but by his willingness to continue delivering what the prophetic tradition claims must be spoken, regardless of its reception. This realization brings with it both comfort and challenge. The comfort lies in understanding that the ultimate responsibility for his message belongs not to him, but to the one who sends it. The challenge lies in accepting that faithfulness to his calling may require him to continue speaking words that bring him nothing but rejection and pain. The age of resistance has only begun, and already he can see that it will demand from him reserves of strength and perseverance that he is only beginning to discover within himself. As the seasons cycle through their ancient rhythm around Jerusalem, Jeremiah settles into the strange life of one who belongs fully neither to heaven nor earth, but exists in the uncomfortable space between them. The resistance he encounters becomes as familiar as the sunrise, a daily reminder that speaking truth in a world that prefers illusion is perhaps the loneliest occupation ever devised by divine wisdom. Yet in that loneliness he begins to find a fellowship with all those throughout history who have been called to stand against the comfortable consensus of their times and speak words that no one wants to hear but everyone needs to receive. The walls of the small chamber where Jeremiah now spends his nights seem to press closer with each passing week, as if the very stones respond to the weight of the visions that flood through his consciousness during the dark hours before dawn. Sleep has become not rest, but battlefield. A place where heaven and earth collide in images so vivid and terrible that he often wakes with tears streaming down his face and words of judgment burning on his lips like coals from a divine altar. The first vision comes to him on a night when Jerusalem lies peaceful under a canopy of stars, its citizens secure in their beds, trusting in walls built by human hands and promises interpreted by human wisdom. But in the realm of prophetic sight, Jeremiah sees beyond the immediate tranquility to the storm clouds gathering on the horizon of history. His spirit is carried northward, beyond the familiar hills of Judah, to lands where great armies move like shadows across the earth. He sees them first as a distant darkness, a writhing mass that seems to devour light itself as it advances across the ancient world. The sound that accompanies this vision is unlike anything in human experience. Not quite thunder, not quite the roar of floodwaters, but something that combines both with an undertone of inevitability that makes his bones ache with dread. As the vision sharpens, the darkness resolves into countless thousands of warriors, their bronze armor catching the firelight of burning cities, their faces set with the grim determination of those who serve an empire that knows no limits to its appetite for conquest. The army moves with mechanical precision, each soldier a component in a vast machine designed for the single purpose of breaking down every wall, overturning every throne, and reducing the proud achievements of centuries to rubble and ash. At their head rides a figure whose presence seems to bend reality around him. A king whose very existence represents the collision of human ambition with divine permission. This is Nebuchadnezzar, though Jeremiah does not yet know the name that will echo through his prophecies like a funeral drum. But it is not the foreign army itself that fills the young prophet with the deepest anguish. It is the recognition that this approaching storm represents not merely political upheaval, but what the texts frame as divine judgment. Heaven's response to decades of spiritual adultery and covenant breaking that have festered in the heart of his beloved nation like an untreated wound. The tears that flow during these visions are not only for the suffering to come, but for the willful blindness that has made such suffering inevitable. Night after night, the visions deepen and multiply, each one revealing new facets of the catastrophe that approaches Jerusalem like a slow-motion earthquake. He sees the great temple, that magnificent structure which has stood as the symbol of divine presence among his people, reduced to smoking ruins. The golden vessels that have held sacred offerings for generations lie scattered and broken, their precious metal destined to decorate the temples of foreign gods in distant Babylon. The human cost of these coming events unfolds before his prophetic sight with devastating clarity. He watches families torn apart as parents are separated from children, husbands from wives, the living from the dead. He sees the proud nobles of Jerusalem, men who have grown comfortable in their certainty that their status provides immunity from consequence, stripped of dignity and driven into exile like common criminals. The streets that have echoed with celebration and commerce fall silent except for the sound of weeping and the footsteps of conquerors dividing the spoils of a fallen city. Perhaps most heartbreaking of all, Jeremiah witnesses the spiritual dimension of the coming catastrophe. The people who have spent generations assuming that their religious heritage provides automatic protection discover too late that ceremony without substance, ritual without relationship, tradition without transformation offers no shelter when what the sources describe as divine judgment finally breaks. Their cries for help seem to echo into empty skies, not because heaven has ceased to care, but because they have spent so long ignoring heaven's voice that they no longer know how to call out above the noise of their own rebellion. These visions leave him weak and shaken, but they also bring with them a terrible gift: the ability to see his people's present condition with prophetic clarity. What others perceive as prosperity and security, he recognizes as the calm before the storm. What they interpret as evidence of divine favor, he understands as the final moments of divine patience before judgment becomes inevitable. The comfortable assumptions that sustain daily life in Jerusalem appear to him now as gossamer threads, beautiful but utterly inadequate to bear the weight they have been asked to support. The physical toll of these nocturnal encounters begins to show itself in ways that concern his family and puzzle his few remaining friends. His face grows gaunt, marked by the kind of premature aging that comes not from years but from carrying burdens too heavy for any human soul. His eyes develop a quality that makes people uncomfortable, as if he sees through the surface of things to depths they would prefer to leave unexamined. His voice, when he speaks of what he has seen, carries an authority that seems to come from somewhere beyond his own experience. Standing in the dust of Jerusalem's ruins, surrounded by the echoes of prophecy fulfilled, we come to understand that Jeremiah's tears were never meant for him alone. They were the tears of every soul who has ever stood at the crossroads between comfort and truth, between silence and speaking what must be heard. His secret grief becomes our shared inheritance, a reminder that the price of seeing clearly is often the burden of weeping for what others cannot yet perceive. The young priest who once walked uncertain through temple courts became the voice that history could not ignore. His visions, born in darkness and delivered through tears, proved more enduring than the bronze gates of Babylon, more lasting than the walls of Jerusalem itself. In choosing faithfulness over acceptance, isolation over compromise, he discovered that some truths can only be spoken by those willing to stand alone. Today, in our own age of comfortable assumptions and convenient blindness, Jeremiah's story whispers across the centuries with urgent relevance. His tears remind us that speaking truth to power, standing for principle against pressure, and holding fast to conviction in the face of mockery are not relics of ancient history but timeless callings that each generation must embrace anew. If this journey through one man's encounter with destiny has stirred something within you, please share it with others who might need to hear that even in our darkest moments of doubt and resistance, we are never truly alone. Subscribe to join us as we continue exploring the hidden stories that shaped our world and discover how the courage of the past can illuminate the path forward. Until we meet again in the shadows of history, may you find strength in knowing that